I want you to imagine that you were born in the year 1700. Your life would actually be expected to be pretty much just like your parents' lives, like your grandparents' lives. In fact, more or less just like the lives of almost everybody who lived before you for thousands of years. Most of you would live on a farm, and your future would be, well, farming in some way or another. Very few of you would have more than just a subsistence amount to manage to eat. And so, what would you have to look forward to? Well, more or less exactly the kind of life that your parents and people around you knew from the past. Today, that's very far from the case, right? Your lives are already very different from mine was up to your age, and mine was radically different from those of my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Think about the things that were inventions of the 20th century that were not available before. What are some of those things? What kinds of inventions did the 20th century see that changed people's lives?
Television and radio.
Television and radio.
The internet.
The internet. Somebody mentioned cell phones. Yeah. Cars. Good. Cameras. I mean, cameras existed before 1900, but they weren't at all commonplace. They were real rarities and very difficult to operate. Yeah.
Passenger planes.
Passenger what?
Passenger planes.
Oh, airplanes. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
New medicines.
Oh, yes, all sorts of medicines. Think about the fact that when I was a child, polio was still a major thing. It was something that afflicted a large number of children. And I can actually remember when I was old enough, well, actually when they invented the polio vaccine. I was, a little kid then, but still, that was a brand new thing. And it was a huge relief to parents that large numbers of children would no longer be struck down with polio. Can you think of other things that have changed people's lives in the past 100 years or so? Yeah?
Computers, in particular mobile computers.
Okay, good. Not just computers, but laptops, things like iPads, right? Personal computers. That was a huge revolution some decades after the computer, which, I mean, go and look at some movies from the 50s and 60s and look at the computers that are there. They're the size of refrigerators, and there are banks of them to take up large rooms. And now, this has more power, computing-wise, than the entire U.S. defense network in the 1960s. Yeah?
Modern appliances like washing machines and dishwashers.
Yes, washing machines, dishwashers, dryers, all sorts of appliances that save labor. Yes?
Satellites.
Satellites, good.
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons, absolutely.
Mass production became common.
Good, mass production became common, so all sorts of things that were available before became affordable to the mass of people. The average person 150 years ago had only, one or two sets of clothes, typically two so that you could wash one while you were wearing the other. Clothing was very, very expensive. Now, think about your closets. Actually, part of the reason my own daughter didn't go to a certain university is that when she was there, the main thing that her group of students was asking about were the size of the closets and where they could put all their clothes. And she thought, what are you doing? You should be, interested in learning all this stuff, not figuring out where you could put your clothing. But that wouldn't have been a problem to somebody in the 19th century at all. Where do you put your clothes? Well, one set's on your back, and one set has to be folded up somewhere. That's pretty much it. So there's a huge transformation as a result of mass production about just how much people can have and how affordable things are. Well, anyway, all that is really quite dramatic. I want to talk today about an attitude of realism that arose. It's always been part of our philosophical and our common sense heritage, but it was a common view, certainly by the end of the 19th century, and it was bolstered a great deal by technological advances, by scientific discoveries. The realist has a very straightforward and very simple view. Some things are real. They're really out there. They're independent of the mind. They are not merely projections or mental constructions or artifices of some kind. They're really there. And there are some truths about these objects that are independent of our minds. They are what they are, no matter what we happen to think or say about them. The opposite of that view is idealism. These days, many people call it anti-realism, or constructionism, or something like that, because idealism got sort of a bad name. But it's the same basic view. The idea here is that everything is actually mind-dependent. everything is really a construction or projection of the mind. There are no mind-independent facts, and there are no mind-independent objects. Well, common sense seems to support the realist view. This table, for example, seems to be real. It seems to be independent of my mind. I turn away from it. Is it still there? Yes. Now, that's just me, right? Suppose we all shut our eyes, so nobody's looking at the table. Let's do the experiment. 1001, shut your eyes. Okay, open. Well, we don't know whether it was still here. On the other hand, we tend to think, yes, it still was here. It really does have a mind-independent existence. It doesn't go away just because we're not looking at it, and so forth. Now, this becomes an issue in ethics as well. Are moral values the kinds of things that are independent of the mind? Or are they actually constructions of the mind? It seems to us a rather bizarre view to say that a table or an electron is really a mental construction. But it seems a lot less strange to think of good and evil, or right and wrong, or rights and responsibilities as mental constructions, as things we impose on the world. And so the issue between realism and idealism is very much alive in ethics. I mean, it's alive in general, but in ethics it has a special power. Because you might think, wait a minute, it matters a lot whether certain things really are right and wrong independently of me, or whether I, or at least we together, are the sources of all value. And so I might think that I'm the source of all value, that I call certain things right and wrong, that I'm the source of meaning, that things have meaning in my life simply because I give them a certain meaning. Or I might think, no, my life has a meaning that is established outside me, and it has a significance that has nothing to do with what I happen to think it is. And moreover, what's right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust, those are things that are true independently of me, and maybe even independently of all of us. Maybe there is some other source outside me, maybe even outside humanity in general, that we all have to answer to. Religious thinkers are, of course, drawn to that possibility, to a realist conception that all of this is not only mind-independent, but really humanity-independent. On the other hand, it's not just religious thinkers who think that. You can think, no, the just, the good, the right, the wrong, these are things that have a meaning independently of human beings and our conceptions of them. But of course, you can also say, no, these are things we create, we construct in order to organize our social life together. But it is a crucial question. Am I free to assign my life any meaning I want? Am I free to assign my own value, my own actions, any values I want? Those are crucial questions. Are these things that are imposed from without? Or is this something that I can decide? Or that we as a culture collectively can decide? Maybe I can have freedom to do this sort of thing, as the existentialists that we'll study later think. Or maybe I'm answerable to something else, something outside myself, something higher. Now, the same question that is true for me is true for all of us taken together. Are we together free to assign meaning and value however we like, or are we answerable to something else? That's a question that will haunt us all the way through this course. And so I've already talked about one of the mottos for the course. The key idea behind civilization, Fernandez is saying in that little quote, is realism. That there's something that exists independently of us, that we can't simply make it up. Human institutions aren't the ultimate sources of authority. That's the realist position, that by the end of the 19th century was more or less common sense. And idealism, now, was a very powerful philosophical view at the time. And so today we're going to be looking at the stories of Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes stories, which are thoroughly committed to realism. And in fact, almost all crime stories, detective stories, that whole genre, end up committed to realism. Why? Because who did it has to have some mind-independent existence. Imagine a story like this where you're looking to find out who did it, who committed the murder. And in the end you say, well, it's just a matter of what we collectively all think. Who did it? Well, I think for me it was the butler. But for you it was the gardener. And in the end there's no fact of the matter. It's just whatever we decide. It's like, no, come on. If that's the case, what is there to write a detective story about? So almost all detective fiction, not all. There are postmodern detective stories, but mostly this is a genre that is committed to realism. And we're going to see it, not only in Fernandez here, but in those stories. However, next time we're going to be looking at someone who is giving us a view diametrically opposed to that, coming out of an idealist tradition. And so that sort of dichotomy is something that we're going to see again and again throughout the course. All right, well, I want to go back to that question of how life changed in the 19th century before we start looking at the stories. Because the stories are occurring against a certain scientific background as well as a philosophical background. After all, Holmes is constantly doing experiments. He's constantly using scientific method. And the triumph of science that's revealed in part in these stories is something that by 1900 has become commonplace. People respect science and say, aha, it's a kind of ideal of human knowledge and of human activity in general. Partly because it brings about three great revolutions. The agricultural revolution in Europe, at any rate in the 18th century primarily, and then really two stages of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. They changed the way people lived dramatically. So what I said, human life was more or less the same up to 1700, that changes in the 19th century and then changes even more dramatically in the 20th century. Consider that now in my pocket I have the power to access almost all information available anywhere in the world. I have more information at my fingertips now than an Oxford professor sitting in the greatest library in the world had 100 years ago. And I use it mostly to look at cat pictures and play Pokemon Go. However, I sometimes use it for philosophy. So, anyway, this is something that really is a remarkable thing. How did it come about? Well, there really are these three stages. From 1750 to 1800, the agricultural revolution. Then, from 1800 to 1850, roughly, the first industrial revolution. In the second half of the 19th century, the second industrial revolution. The first transformed farming and made food much more widely available than it had been before. The second was the era of the great factories, steel, railroads, steamships. And then the second part, chemicals, the development of electricity, the development of pharmaceuticals, all sorts of things that changed the average person's life in dramatic ways. Let's start with a very quick look at the agricultural revolution. What did it mean that people suddenly understood crop rotation better? That they understood how to fertilize fields and irrigate them effectively? That they developed the technologies for doing these things? Well, it meant that people could grow more food. That had a consequence. Food became much less expensive. Actually, in my lifetime, food has become much less expensive. Now, a pound of ground meat costs really about what, at least if you get it on sale, it costs about what it did in the 70s. Food was, when I was your age, much more expensive than it is now. But it was a much more dramatic change in the 19th century and even earlier. It required a lot less labor. So several things followed from that. One is people had a lot more money for other things. Up to 1800, most people spent almost all of their income on just food, clothing, and shelter. There was almost no disposable income for the great mass of humanity. But after the agricultural revolution, food no longer consumed a very large part of your budget. And that meant you had money left over for other things. It also meant there was a vast supply of surplus labor. All these people who were no longer needed on the farms to raise food. And so there was a movement of people from the farms to the cities. Finally, there was capital for investment. People did have extra money. That money was something that people could pool together and actually use then to make investments in, for example, constructing the factories of the Industrial Revolution. So what did people learn? They learned how to irrigate more effectively, how to plant more effectively. They learned how to rotate crops, how to harvest more effectively. And so they were getting much more food per acre than people had been able to do before. That kind of bounty that you see symbolized in that sort of cornucopia is something that was a rarity up to 1800, but since has become fairly commonplace. Now, how did the farms get to be more effective? It was not just technological advance, it was partly also legal advances. Pictured there is John Locke, who said everyone has a right to life, liberty, and property. And the right to property was very important. In order to develop a farm that was an efficient farm that grew a lot of food per acre, you had to make investments in that farm. You had to rotate crops. You had to allow fields to lie fallow. You had to do a lot of things that required long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking. And if you couldn't rely on that property being yours, it made no sense to do that kind of long-term thinking. Suppose at any point, if your farm became successful, you could be pushed off the land and somebody else would take it. There's not much point to you to really making it efficient and to putting in those investments. So in short, it required a stability of property and the rule of law in order for people to actually make these investments. It wasn't enough to have the technology. So moving power away from kings and toward parliaments, away from a government of men toward a government of laws was actually a crucial part of enabling this revolution to take place. Now, yes, here I'm showing the kinds of things people did in 1800, and then the kinds of things people did in 1900. One there is still pictured in farming, but notice the others are all pictured doing something else. And in fact, that's what happened between 1800 and 1900. 80% of the population worked in farming in 1800. By 1900, it was down to 20%. What is the population in the United States today involved in farming? 2%. So it's gone from having 80% of the people to, in 1900, only 20% of the people raising the food, now to actually 2% of the people raising the food and having a vast quantity left over for export. Well, that was the agricultural revolution. During that time, then, and during the Industrial Revolution, 60% of the population moved from the countryside to the cities. We went from 80% on the farms to only 20% of the farms. That means more than half the population moved from the countryside into towns and cities. That is a huge and unprecedented movement of human populations. How did all of this come about, and what did those people do? Well, they provided the manpower for the first Industrial Revolution, which took place in a number of stages. There was Edmund Cartwright and his invention of the power loom that enabled people to make cloth, and so clothing, much less expensively than they had before. Look at this shirt I'm wearing. It's a very fine shirt. Not quite as nice as the Brooks Brothers one I ripped last class, but nevertheless, it's a good shirt. And yet, it was not very expensive. Why? Well, in my case, because I bought it at Goodwill. But even if I hadn't bought it at Goodwill, it would not have been very expensive. And why? Because it was produced on a machine. Before that time, every bit of clothing was hand sewed, and so a huge amount of labor went into it. Cloth was made by hand on a loom, and that required a huge amount of labor. In Great Britain, you can see the prevalence of the looms. There were 2,400 in 1813. By 1850, there were 250,000 of these machines making cloth. So the price of clothing fell dramatically during the first half of the 19th century in England. Here you see what they actually looked like. A second major invention was James Watt, who in the 1760s invented the steam engine. It took a while for it to become effective enough and efficient enough that it was really useful practically, but by 1782 that happened. By 1800, a steam engine was capable of generating 10,000 horsepower. 10,000 horses would have been required to generate that much power. Think about that, because up to that time, horses and oxen were the main sources of power beyond just human effort. By 1850, it was 1.3 million horsepower, an amount of power that was just undreamt of before that time. And so there is Watt staring into the fire, getting his idea. And there is the very first rotary steam engine on display at the British Museum. What did it make possible? Well, the invention of the railroads, of steamships, and then roads and canals, things that were required to make those forms of transportation possible. Railroads improved the ability of people to get around dramatically. In 1804, there was the first locomotive. It didn't look like much. It looked like a child's toy, and it could go 5 miles an hour. Well, by 1830, it could go 16 miles an hour, and we had the first rail line constructed in Britain. By 1850, trains could go 50 miles an hour, and there were 6,000 miles of track already in the United Kingdom alone. And so here's a steam locomotive from that era. The result of this vast movement to the cities was a tremendous growth. London in 1800 had 1 million people. By 1850, it had 2.5 million. There were no cities in Britain other than London that were over 100,000 in 1800. By 1850, there were 9. And so you can see people were flooding from the countryside where they no longer had jobs on the farms to find jobs in the factories. And fortunately, the technology was available and the capital was available that enabled people to actually construct the factories of the first industrial revolution. Now, life in those factories wasn't necessarily great. People worked 12 to 16-hour days. They were exposed to noxious fumes, high temperatures, dangerous conditions. My own great-grandfather died in an industrial accident as a result of the high temperatures. He was overcome and passed out in the steel mill. The foreman sent him home and wanted to have someone take him home. He said, no, I can get there. He was riding on an open-air streetcar and, again, overcome by heat exhaustion, passed out and fell off the car and was run over. That was around 1903, I guess? Anyway, it took some days for my great-grandmother to even find out what happened to it. So this was a difficult thing. Conditions were highly dangerous. Working conditions were unpleasant. And you see this depicted in the art of the period. That's not a fire, that's just a factory behind those buildings. Here you see the section of Pittsburgh I grew up in, as it would have looked about 100 years ago. Now, large numbers of people, on the other hand, as a result of this, had discretionary income. Clothing was much less expensive, so was food. And so people could afford other kinds of things. So the cost of goods coming down meant that people could actually afford to have nicer clothes, actually afford to trade and get more exotic merchandise, could afford to travel. There were increases in income and wealth. They were highly unequal at this stage. A lot of people lived in pretty miserable conditions, crowded cities without plumbing. Here you see people living in the backyards of houses, and houses divided into rooms where entire families would live. There was sewage and garbage in the streets. There wasn't really adequate plumbing. Widespread disease. There were outbreaks of cholera throughout the 19th century, especially the first half. And tremendous income inequality. In 1801, the top 1% had 25% of national income in the United Kingdom. It was 35% by 1848, compared to about 18 or 19% today. So, and today people think that's high inequality. Well, it was nothing compared to the first half of the 19th century. But the second half of the 19th century changed things dramatically with the second industrial revolution. It spread affluence much more widely. So, it did a lot to alleviate the problems that arose. Large numbers of people did have discretionary income. Manufacturing did decrease the cost of goods, and all of that continued throughout the last half of the century. People started thinking in terms of what they wanted, not just in terms of what they needed to survive. So there was an entirely new pattern of production and consumption. The average person's life just began to look a lot different from what it had appeared to be 50 years before and then 100 years before that. As a result of declining death rates, there was also a dramatic increase in population. The population of Europe went from 270 million to 460 million, almost doubling. And death rates in general declined for two primary reasons: the development of medicines, of pharmaceuticals, of ways of treating infection, eliminating cholera, and so on, and also the advent of plumbing, getting the sewage out of the streets. My grandfather was a plumber, and he used to say, the plumbers are the chief agents of civilization. What makes civilization possible? Plumbing, he would say. And in many ways, he was right. Get that many people together in a small space, you get not civilization, you get chaos, you get disease, you get death. But plumbing changes that. It makes it possible for people to get rid of waste and actually have clean water. And that sort of sanitation improvement does a huge amount to improve human life. Well, in addition to that, there was the germ theory of disease. Today, we sort of take for granted the idea of germs, the thought of bacteria, of viruses, of the importance of cleanliness. All of that was something developed around the middle of the 19th century. A Hungarian physician, Ignaz Semmelweis, was really the first to develop the germ theory of disease. And Louis Pasteur is the one who put that then into practice and actually began a process of pasteurization that did sanitize many processes and made food and water supplies much, much safer. Semmelweis himself has a very sad story. He ended up dying. He was beaten to death, in fact, in a mental institution. People thought he was crazy for being convinced that, there were germs and people had to wash their hands. And yet he drastically cut the rate of infection in the hospitals in Vienna by just insisting that doctors wash their hands. And so he actually was responsible for vast improvements in human health. Now, this had a huge impact. In 1750, only about a third of babies who were born survived birth. Think about that. 2/3 of babies died in the process of being born. By 1900, 85% survived. Today, occasionally a child will die in childbirth, or a woman will die in childbirth, but it's quite rare. In 1750, it was the norm. In the 1800s, the advent of not only the understanding of disease, but processes that would fight disease helped tremendously. Well, all of this led to massive immigration, a huge increase in population, a huge increase in the demand for labor, but in different places. So, what happened? London by 1900 had 6.5 million people. There were many more European cities, over 100,000. People moved to the cities not only because they weren't needed on the farms, but because there was employment in the factories of the Industrial Revolution. And these tremendous growths in population in the cities weren't restricted to Europe. Here you see the same thing in the United States. These bars representing the population of various cities in 1850 and then in 1900. So you can see Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Milwaukee, all grew tremendously. I mean, many more than 2 times the population, really 3 to 10 times the population they had just 50 years earlier. And of course, that crossed national borders as well. This is Ellis Island, where vast numbers of immigrants came to the United States. And actually, this slideshow was long, partly because I got fascinated by these Ellis Island pictures and started including many of them, but you get the idea. Okay, yes, well, the advent of the steel industry. And having grown up around the mills, I've got many pictures of those. And sometimes, of course, things went wrong. Well, okay, the chemical industry, similarly. The advent of electricity. Edison inventing the electric light bulb. And here are some of his drawings. Here are some of his early prototypes. Then, the telephone. That's the first telephone. Doesn't look much like our telephones today. A telegraph machine. In any case, then the advent of radio, Marconi's invention, the advent of the bicycle, which enabled people to get around much more quickly, and then, of course, the automobile. That's the first Ford, constructed in 1896. And there's Henry Ford and his wife taking a ride. And then, of course, in 1903, the airplane. Well, all the economic advances of the 19th century meant that people had much more income. By the end of the century, people tended to work 5.5, 10-hour days. This was a time when real wages were soaring, even for the average person. The department stores, the large manufacturing plants, the consumer products that we take for granted now, most of those were the product, really, of the late 19th century, when affluence became widespread enough that you could actually have grocery chains of department stores, and that type of thing. Here is a Berlin department store, for example. You can see the grandeur of the era. Now, that sort of advent of middle-class living, a sort of new lifestyle that people enjoyed, in the cities especially, was accompanied by educational advances. Schooling, as we know it today, is a product of mostly the second half of the 19th century. And the effect of that, a rise of popular cultures, of libraries, of women's education, Bryn Mawr College there, of popular entertainment, of team sports, the first World Series in 1903.